Hello and welcome to Chapter 20, Communities and Ecosystems. This is our 10-minute talk, and we're going to cover all of communities and kind of their interactions with the ecosystems. Next. Basically what we're seeing is that biology and society really matters, biodiversity really matters, and our ecosystems loss kind of really matters. And what we're seeing is that ecosystems actually do stuff for us. They help purify the air. They decompose waste. They recycle nutrients. Wetlands act as buffers for coastal populations against hurricanes and floods and things like that. And they also filter pollutants. And by the way, they look really nice. I mean, this looks really fun being able to see a whale out there, and it's nice to see forest and everything else like that. When we look at biodiversity, we see that we are losing what we call this thing called biodiversity. And biodiversity has a couple of forms. It has genetic diversity. And if we look over here, things like wheat and corn, it's important that we have a lot of different varieties of wheat and corn because they have different resistances, diseases, and different patterns of society of actually areas where they grow a little bit better. Our species diversity is very important. We'll talk about that. And so we may think of a species, oh, there's not very many of those species there, and those guys don't do very much. But when now that we look and we realize stuff, is that certain individual populations, even though they don't have a very large number, they perform a very specific function, and that will affect us as a whole. And then looking at ecosystem diversity, again, we have so many areas on this planet where life is, and in order to basically have life all over the place, we need to have organisms able to reach and look at different diversities. And so again, if we lose these ecosystems, we lose other services that those ecosystems do for us. And again, we tend to think of nature as just kind of being out there and it just does stuff. But you know what? Nature does stuff for us. The organisms that are there are actually doing something. And again, air and water purification, climate regulation, and erosion control are three really big things that we tend to not look at that our ecosystems do for us, they do automatically for us all the time. And this services in the United States is roughly $33 trillion. And so we're seeing when we don't pay attention to the ecosystems that is coming back to haunt us because when these systems go away, then we miss them. Okay. Again, when we look at species, we want to look at interspecific interactions between the species. And this slide here really kind of demonstrates that, is that when we look at two species, they can have a head-to-head competition. And what we tend to see is when species compete with one another, we tend to see the effects to be negative. Okay. Again, the effects on the negative one. So when we have two species competing head-to-head against one another, it's a negative effect. A lot of times we have what's called mutualism, where two species will kind of work together, and that gives us a positive effect on each one. And then basically this interspecies competition, where we have exploitation, we have predation, herbivory, parasites, and that's where one organism eats another. This is an old view of these communities, and what we kind of actually see is that all of these guys all together perform a function that actually helps one another. And so when we have two organisms together, again, this is a sea anemone that stings, and then you have the clownfish that helps the sea anemone. And a lot of sea anemones will have algae that kind of live in them that help them get food. And we look at this and we tell us as positives. This one here, we look at this as being negative, but it's really not so. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The next thing I want to talk about, trophic structure. Trophic basically means kind of where you eat. And a community's trophic structure determines the passes of energy and nutrients from plants and other organisms. And so what we see in our ecosystems is that we have energy and we have materials. And so the energy actually comes and gets absorbed in a group by these organisms that we call producers. They can be plants, and in a liquid portion they can be phytoplankton. The plants and phytoplankton are eaten by slightly bigger organisms or other organisms. These are what we call the primary consumers. And again, in the land area here, we don't think about it. We tend to think about cows and deer eating stuff, but most of the organisms that eat plants are actually insects. And in the primary producers in the aquatic system tend to be zooplankton. And then we have secondary consumers, which eats them, the tertiary consumers, which eat them, and even the quaternary consumers. We tend to not have organisms like these are what we call top predators. We tend to not have predators of those top predators because it's so hard to get all these nutrients up to this area. And again, you can't. You'd have to have an organism that would have to go so far and wide and feed on so many of these that basically it's just not possible. And so what we usually end up with what we call quaternary consumers. The problem with this is that we tend to get what's called biological magnification. We'll talk about it a little bit. In that, when we have poisons in relatively low amounts or toxins in low amounts at the lower portion of the feed chain, it increases as it goes up to the food chain. So again, one of the other reasons why we tend to not have these quaternary predators is that this magnification would come up, and here what we look at is that we have these things that are called PCBs, which were used in electric. There are a number of different toxins that we have out there that are used in industrial waste. And what we would see is in our local environment, they're not present in very many numbers. However, when you get the phytoplankton, which is eaten by the zooplankton, which is eaten by smelt, which are small trout, lake trout, and herrings, what we see is it gets magnified. And this is because the nutrients that are taken up by the phytoplankton are fat soluble and they remain in the organism. And so when you get materials, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, most part you sweat or you pee or you breathe out waste products. But trouble is, if waste products are soluble in fat, they're going to stay in your body until they're metabolized. They don't go. And so what happened is that we were seeing this pollution not having effect on these organisms here because they weren't there in high enough numbers. However, when we see the go, we saw those numbers. And so again, when we human beings eat trout, we eat tuna, which are all predators. We're seeing a buildup of these toxins inside of us, and we're seeing a buildup of that in our body. Whereas if we were to eat smelt, or even if we were to eat phytoplankton, we wouldn't see that buildup. So I took a long time on this. In our food webs, we have a number of different types of organisms. You have herbivores, you have carnivores, omnivores are both an herbivore and a carnivore, and they kind of eat everything. And what I showed you before was kind of like this food chain, but in reality what we know is we have something that's called a food web. And that organisms like, again, here an eagle is not only going to eat a snake, but they're going to take a mouse when they can, and they're going to take other things. And, quite frankly, when they find some fruit and it's there and it's ready, they're going to eat that as well. And so we see this kind of interconnectivity, and that when there's not a lot of mice around, that the bird can actually take another organism, or when there's not a lot of snakes around. And so, again, that's what we human beings do. We eat a lot of these kind of different things. The next thing I wanted to talk a little bit about was this looking at species diversity in the community. And we have something that's called species richness, which is the number of species in the community, and relative abundance, which is the number of individuals here. And so we have two forests here which kind of differ a little bit. And they differ in their diversity. Actually, they differ in their richness. And so what that figure shows here is that in woodland A, we have lots of this one tree, and we have relatively small amounts of these other trees. In woodland B, we have an equal amount. And we would think that having these equal amounts would be the best thing for a community, but it's not always the case. A lot of times, relatively small abundance of species can have a big effect on a population. And this is the concept of what we call a keystone species, the species whose broad impact on a community is much larger than total mass or abundance of the species. And where this came about is actually looking at the sea star. And we see that the sea star was responsible for eating kind of several other organisms. And however, if the sea star did not eat these other organisms, that the other organisms ate so many of the other organisms that, well, we'll talk about it a little bit later. Okay. Next thing I want to talk about is our communities, and our communities are always disturbed. We tend to think about things in life as being kind of really, we tend to think about things in life as being kind of really controlled, but they're not. Things happen. And so there's storms, fires, floods, and droughts that happen kind of all the time. Disturbances are can cause the emergence of a previously unknown disease, but disturbances are opportunities for kind of organisms to grow, and sometimes that can be a bad thing. That can sometimes be a good thing. So here's a forest. When a tree falls over in the forest, it leaves some area open for some other organisms to actually grow. And this gives us the idea of succession. So ecological succession is basically where we have a change in the organisms in the population, And what we see in something like primary succession, and we see here, that's my, okay. What we see here is a bunch of lava, and then plants being able to grow on lava is an example of primary succession. It's hard to do because there's no soil here. It's very hard for organisms to grow there. Once organisms grow and they die, and they'll leave some soil. Secondary succession is where basically a community is destroyed, but it's left the soil intact so things can grow. And we tend to see these during fires, floods, and severe storms, where basically here's a fire over here, and this fire left an area pretty much open so these blue lupins can actually grow. And then so an ecosystem basically includes a community of species in a given area, and the abiotic factors, what we call energy, soil characteristics, and water, these other areas. A terrarium is a prime example of an ecosystem, and we looked at one of those today. And what we look at is that when we look at an ecosystem, there's two things that go in. There's energy and there's chemicals. And energy actually flows through an ecosystem, and chemicals tend to be recycled in a system. And we require energy for growth and maintenance and reproduction of many species. And we see that the Earth receives lots and lots of calories of energy from the sun, but very little of it is converted into food. And so what we tend to see is that of the materials that come down on the energy that comes down to our planet, basically only about 1% of it is converted to energy from photosynthesis. Again, because not all the Earth is covered by organisms. And then even that energy that we get in here, these organisms, they convert that energy, of the energy that the primary producers get, most of it gets kind of wasted in feces. Okay, when they eat wood, they don't totally digest the wood. The bits of the wood that still have calories in it are reduced. About 15 calories are used for growth, and only about 35 calories are actually used for cellular respiration. So we only see about 15 calories actually go into that. And so the energy that we lose on each level is basically about 80 to 90%. And here we look at it about 10%. And so, again, if we have our primary producers make 10,000 calories, the tertiary consumers is only about 10 calories. And then the fifth consumer above that would be even less. And so that's one of the reasons why we tend to not see those levels, ecosystem levels. Human resources, the idea with this, as it tells us in the human resources, is that when we humans are carnivores and we eat stuff, the same field of corn can support a lot less human beings. But again, I think it's a lot more fun to be a meat eater than it is a vegetarian. But that's another story. The next thing that we got to look at is chemical ecosystems, and I will kind of skip over that because it's a 10-minute talk. But basically, what we tend to see in these ecosystems is that nutrients are recycled around in this area. And the three important cycles are the carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen cycle. And I'll leave you to that. But basically what we want to do is these biogeochemical cycles can be local or they can be global. The carbon cycle and the nitrogen cycle are actually examples of global cycles because the carbon and the nitrogen can kind of move all over the planet. We may have, for very short local shortages of it, but not much because it can move all over. Phosphorus, on the other hand, is one of these molecules that can't actually move too far. It's actually soluble in water. And what we can get is an area that if you don't have enough phosphorus, you're not going to have any growth there. And I'll leave you here to kind of look at these systems on that. We'll take a look at that during class. The last thing that we want to look at is basically organisms do stuff for us, and this thing that we call bioremediation. We can have organisms actually, in this one here, they're using kind of mustard seed to actually leach poisonous mercury out of the soil, and then again, what we call restoration biology is basically where we can if we know the biology of a system, we know what a system do, we can set up these automatic systems to do it. Again, here in the Bay Area, we have, and I was talking about the biophelia, the Bay Area, if we let nature and these ecosystems work for us, they'll do the job for us kind of relatively free. It doesn't mean it doesn't cost anything, but it's relatively free to us. And lastly, what I want to talk about is this kind of evolution connection with biophelia, is that the organisms that we see give us joy. They do a number of things, and they're important in themselves. And so, again, our ability to interact with our environment is a fun and a good thing. All right, thank you very much.